It's live.
Okay, now it's live. We're gonna get started, and Alan, I moved the camera back as far as we possibly can. When it comes to like questions and stuff,
Yep.
I'll move it if there's anyone that you can't see, so that you can see who you're talking to. Okay?
Okay. It seems like I could see the whole U, like the shape of the tables, the U.
Is there anyone?
Oh no, that hand. I don't see the person who's got the hand. I just see a hand like floating. But is that the last person?
There's three people.
Three of
Oh,
them.
there's
There's three.
yeah,
So
no problem.
this is Alan Shlemon. We should probably start with what the temperature is where you're at.
What's the temperature? I don't know. It's probably around. Kyle, do you know? Maybe like 65, 70. Yeah. Oh, it's 82. Never mind. It's 82. So is that about what it's at with you guys?
Yeah, you're right around there.
Around 82? Yeah. You guys must be hot wearing all those coats.
Yeah. It's actually 13 here. So.
It's 13, huh? Wow.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to you. And we had talked about having some Q&A at the end, so I'll have everyone hold their questions for the end.
Okay, that's fine.
All right.
Well, you might be looking at me and wondering a little bit about my background, because oftentimes when I speak on this topic, people can tell that I look Middle Eastern. And the reason for that is because I actually am. I'm not a former Muslim, though. I am what's known as an Assyrian. Now, just out of curiosity, by a show of hands here, how many of you have ever heard of the Assyrian people? Okay, yeah, looks like most of you. So if you're familiar with your Old Testament history, you'll recall the Assyrians are talked a lot about in the Old Testament. Unfortunately for me, we were the sworn enemies of Israel, and so that makes us the sworn enemies of God. So it was kind of funny, though, watching my parents try to spin this in a positive way when I was a kid. You know, they'd come up to me and say, "Hey, guess what, little Alan? You know what? Our people are talked about in the Bible. You know what? We're the bad guys, you know." And so, you know, with a lot of therapy and counseling, you get over some of the emotional turmoil of knowing that God doesn't love your people. And, well, no, he did. But, of course, he wiped us out back in the 7th century BC. It's enough of my problems. Let's talk about the issue of Islam. I'm also going to be sharing some of my PowerPoint slides with you, so I'll probably be able to do that with this. And let me know, can you see the title slide right now?
No, it's actually black.
Oh,
there it is.
Okay.
Oh, okay, perfect. And you can still hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, as probably all of you recall, on the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 Muslim terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes, and they used them as missiles to attack the United States. Of course, they flew one into the Pentagon and a few into the World Trade Center, and in the process of doing that, they killed 2,975 innocent civilians. Now, just 29 days after that event, Oprah Winfrey invited this woman, Queen Rania, on her TV show. Now, Queen Rania is the queen of a Muslim country, the country of Jordan, and she herself is a devout Muslim, and she allegedly can speak on behalf of Islam. That was basically the intent. And obviously that day on Oprah Winfrey's television show, Queen Rania's job was to fix Islam's massive public relations problem. And so she really was intent on trying to answer 2 questions for Oprah Winfrey and, of course, the American audience. And the first was this: do Muslims want to violently force Islam on everybody else? And to this question, Queen Rania said no. She said the fact that Islam is very tolerant means that it doesn't impose anything on other people. Now, Oprah Winfrey, being the good feminist that she is, also wondered, well, Queen Rania, you're a woman in Islam. Doesn't Islam oppress women? And to this question, Queen Rania said no. She says Islam views women as full and equal partners to men, so women's rights are guaranteed by Islam. Now, President Bush was the president at the time, and he commented on this question. He said, Islam's a peaceful religion, and Muslims are a peace-loving people. And as you can imagine, President Obama has weighed in on the issue since becoming president. And he quotes the Quran here, where he says that the Quran teaches that whoever kills an innocent, it's as if he's killed all mankind, and whoever saves a person, it is as if he has saved all mankind. And so you kind of hear this kind of talk from lots of people, politicians and other Muslims, in fact, who say these politically correct statements, but then you wonder, well, wait a minute, you've seen all the things that have been done in the name of Islam, and you're confused. Which is the true Islam? Is it really peaceful? Is it violent? Are Muslims the enemy? And if so, how are we supposed to respond? Fortunately, the Bible gives us a model for how we should approach this question and what we should do. And it's in 2 Corinthians 5:18 through 20. If you have your Bibles, you can pull them out and turn there, 2 Corinthians 5:18 through 20. But I also have it here on the slide. I can bring it up for us. Let me see here. It is... So, just to give you some context in this passage, Paul has just told the Corinthians that they are a new creation, that the old is gone, the new has come. You're familiar with that passage. And then he begins to tell them what sort of benefits come with being a new creation in Christ. And here's where he comes to this particular passage. He says, all of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, and he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. Now, I think Paul makes two important points here in this passage. The first is he tells us what our identity is, and the second is he tells us what our mission is. And that first part about our identity is this. If you claim to be a Christian, which I'm assuming all of us here are, then you already are an ambassador for Christ. Right? That's not a title that's given to you after you've been a believer for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, and then all of a sudden you're given this badge. No, the instant you step over the line and decide to follow Jesus Christ, you become his ambassador. That means you represent him in everything you do and everything you say, and however you come across to other people ultimately is a reflection upon the good name of Christ. So that's the first point I think Paul makes that's important in this passage, is that our identity is we are ambassadors. The second point, though, is that our primary job as an ambassador is to be involved in the process of reconciliation. Because obviously Paul uses that word reconcile a few times, or 5 times in fact, in that passage. And, of course, what does it mean to reconcile? Well, the word reconcile simply means to bring together two parties. And the picture that the Bible paints is that you have God and you have the world, and they are at enmity with one another. However, though, through the process of reconciliation, we are made at peace. And so that is what our mission is to proclaim that message of reconciliation. And so that's why I think this passage is so appropriate for this topic of Islam, is because the Bible teaches we are ambassadors, and our job is to proclaim the message of reconciliation. And so that's our identity, that's our mission, and so with the topic of Islam and with the issue of reaching Muslims, that's the way we should think about this. We are ambassadors of the gospel of Jesus Christ, representing Jesus, and we want to try to proclaim the message of reconciliation to Muslims. Now the question then becomes, well, how do we do that? And the answer is simple. We would do it in the same way that any ambassador would do any type of work themselves. And ambassadors typically do two things. The first thing is they learn, and then they engage. And so let's just try to turn to this first question here, and that is, what does an ambassador need to learn? What do we as Christian ambassadors need to learn about Islam and Muslims? And I think there's a lot of things that we can learn, and there's a lot of ways that we can learn it. Oftentimes, if we have a Muslim friend or a Muslim in our family, this could be helpful because obviously we can just simply talk to them and ask them. Okay? We could read the Quran, for example, which is their holy book. We can study history books about it, or we can watch movies about Islam. The problem, though, that you'll find, and that perhaps you already know, is that even if you had a friend who was a Muslim, maybe he was even an imam to a mosque, he would probably tell you things about Islam, and then you would hear other things about Islam, perhaps from television, perhaps from other Muslims, that would contradict what that other Muslim had told you. And this is the predicament that we often face in our culture today, is that we hear conflicting reports about what is genuine Islam from other reports. And so we're confused, well, what's the true Islam? And so I want to give you a little tactic that will help you to determine how to figure out what is true Islam and what is not true Islam. And what matters in Islam is authority. And so if you want to know whether a teaching is truly Islamic or not, all you got to do is look at authoritative sources and see what do they say. And I want to point you to the three most important authoritative sources in Islam. The first is the Quran. This is the highest source of authority in Islam. It is what Muslims believe to be the written revelation of Allah. And so in it contains what Muslims believe to be the literal words of God, not the inspired words of God like we teach with the Bible, but they believe that these are the literal words of God that were dictated to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century through the angel Gabriel. So in other words, the angel Gabriel dictated the message and all the words of the Quran to Muhammad over a 22-year period. And that's what they believe the Quran is that document of what was dictated to Muhammad. Now they have such a high view of the Quran that they think that the corollary in Christianity to the Quran is not the Bible, but Christ himself. And the reason is because just like we would say that Christ is the divine Logos, the divine Word, they also believe that the Quran is the divine Word in Islam. And that's the way they see that. So that's the first and highest authority in Islam. Now the second authority in Islam is known as the Hadith. And Hadith are simply written traditions of what Muhammad said, did, or approved of. So Hadith literature are simply traditions, written traditions, that record what Muhammad said, did, or approved of. So he spoke and did things and approved of things on all categories of subjects. Some of them on war, some on divorce, some on marriage, some on prayer, some on fasting, some on eating, and all sorts of things. So all this stuff has been categorized and put into these books that you see on the slide there, and they are volumes and volumes of this literature. Now, although Hadith literature is not on par with the Quran, it is nevertheless very authoritative, and the reason is because it gives very practical applications to the broad principles that are found in the Quran. And so, for example, the Quran might tell you to pray, but the Hadith tells you how to pray. The Quran tells you that you need to fast, but the Hadith will tell you how to fast. And so, many of you have probably heard of the term Sharia law. Well, Sharia law is simply a term for what is Islamic law that's instituted in Muslim countries, and the source of information for Sharia law is this Hadith literature. That's where they get it from. So that's why this is so important. And then the third source of authority in Islam is the Sunnah, and this is simply the life example of Muhammad. In other words, Muhammad is considered to be the perfect embodiment of what it means to be a Muslim. So how he lived in his day is authoritative for Muslims today. And it's similar to the way we often talk about Christ. We often say that, well, it used to be popular to wear those wristbands that had the letters WWJD, what would Jesus do? Because we think that how Christ lived is important for how we should live today. Well, Muslims have a similar approach to Muhammad. They believe that how Muhammad lived would be informative for how Muslims should live today. He is a precedent for that. And so this gives us a very handy tool then to determine whether a teaching or a behavior is truly Islamic or not. If you want to know whether it is or not, you got to simply look at those three authoritative sources. Look at the Quran, look at the Hadith, look at the Sunnah. If the teaching or the behavior is taught in those three sources, then it is definitely authoritative, and it's legitimate, and it's part of true Islam. But if it's not included in those, or if those three sources oppose this idea, then of course it's not Islamic. So it doesn't matter what your Muslim friend or family member says. It doesn't matter what an imam says at a mosque. It doesn't matter even what the queen of the country of Jordan says that Islam is. If she could say that Islam is about, needlepoint or playing Monopoly, it wouldn't make it so. What matters in Islam is authority. That's the way, Muslims treat this question, and that's the way we need to take this question seriously as well. So obviously, there could be a lot of, application. Well, what does the Quran say? What do these three sources say about violence and jihad, or about the way women are treated? And you could ask about that if you wanted the Q&A. But I just wanted you to have this idea that this is why you have conflicting reports or claims about what Islam truly is because people just make up stuff and say, well, Islam's about this or that. But in reality, if you want to know who's correct, you got to look at those three sources. Now, the question then becomes, well, what else can we learn about Islam? And I'm going to go back here to this. We can also learn about Muslims' behaviors and beliefs. And their behaviors can be summarized in what's known as the 5 pillars of Islam. The 5 pillars of Islam are 5 things that Muslims are required to do as a part of being a Muslim. And the first one is here on this first slide, and it's called reciting the creed. And this is a confessional statement that Muslims are supposed to make, and they often do when they go to the mosque or when they pray. But it's basically there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger or his prophet. And in fact, if you wanted to become a Muslim, all you have to do is recite this creed, and of course sincerely believe it, and then you become a Muslim. You've started your journey as a Muslim. Okay? So that's the first pillar. That's the first pillar in Islam. That's a required behavior in Islam. A second required behavior in Islam is daily prayer. Muslims have to pray 5 times a day, and they often will try to make sure they are facing towards Mecca, which is a city in Saudi Arabia. And just out of curiosity, does anybody know why they face towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia? Like, what's the significance of that?
The black stone that's there.
Yeah, I heard black stone. There is a black stone, but in actuality, that black stone is embedded in a larger structure called the Kaaba, which is a 30-foot by 30-foot kind of cuboidal-shaped structure that rests in the center of the mosque in Mecca, and that black stone that you're referring to is embedded in that. But it's that building, the Kaaba, which Muslims believe was erected either by Adam, and then later damaged and Abraham restored it, or it was just created by Adam and it was left since then. But because Allah commanded Muslims to pray in that direction, that's the reason why they face always towards Mecca when they pray. So, so daily prayer is a second pillar in Islam, a required behavior in Islam. A third required behavior in Islam is the fast of Ramadan. This is a month-long fast. So for 1 month, they are supposed to fast during the daylight hours, from food, from drinking, from smoking, from sex, and basically it's to commemorate Muhammad receiving the Quran. And you remember, Muhammad received the Quran over a 22-year period via the angel Gabriel dictating, basically, the contents of it to him and him memorizing it. Okay? So that's what the fast of Ramadan is about. A fourth pillar in Islam is to give alms. Muslims have to give 2.5% that goes towards the poor and needy. So technically speaking, if you believe in tithing, it's more affordable to be a Muslim. I'm not saying that should be a motivation to be Muslim, but just for the record. And then a fifth required behavior in Islam is the pilgrimage to Mecca. And this is a required pilgrimage to make at least once in your lifetime. You can do it more, that'd be better, but at least once in your lifetime you have to go to Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and you can see there in the picture on the left there's a mosque, and all those little dots are literally millions of people. It's one of the largest gatherings on the planet every year. And that mosque is gigantic, and in fact they're expanding it right now to hold even, I think, several more million. But you'll notice inside the mosque there's that black masonry structure. It's only black because it's covered with a fabric, and the gold trim around it is just Arabic script that has verses of the Quran on it. But basically it's like a concrete structure, if you will. So that's what you have to do if you're a Muslim. Now, they make exceptions for people who are ill or who can't afford it, but other than that, you pretty much have to go at least at some point in your life. So those are the 5 pillars, required behaviors that Muslims have to do. Now, there's also required beliefs, and these are known as the 6 articles of faith. These are the 6 required beliefs that Muslims must accept in order to be orthodox. And the first one is the most important one. It's the belief in the unity of God. And this is the idea that Allah, or God, is one, that there are no 3 persons in one God, as we teach in the Trinity. No one has the properties that Allah has, and you can't assign properties of Allah to anybody else either. And in fact, to violate this belief is to commit the greatest sin in Islam. And that's known as the sin of shirk. And so, in other words, if you apply divinity to someone other than Allah, like say, for example, you happen to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or that Jesus is part of the Trinity, well then you've committed the sin of shirk. And this is an unpardonable sin, meaning if you die believing or having committed the sin of shirk without repenting, you are guaranteed to go to hell. That's how serious they believe this belief is. Now, they also have a belief in God's angels. This is a second required belief. You have to believe that there are angels that exist in the spiritual realm that administrate God's kingdom. And they actually believe that there are 2 angels that follow each one of you. And one angel records all your good deeds, and the other angel records all of your bad deeds. So, in case you hear that whispering at night, that's probably what it is. Okay, that's what they believe about angels. It's a required belief. They also believe in God's prophets. This is a third required belief. And they believe that there have been prophets sent from God to mankind, to all peoples in all the earth. In other words, they believe, for example, that Adam, like it is in Adam and Eve, was a prophet of Allah. That Noah was a prophet of Allah. That Jonah was a prophet of Allah. That David was a prophet of Allah. That Moses was a prophet of Allah. That Jesus was a prophet of Allah. So they believe that all of these people are legitimate prophets of Allah. So notice they have to believe in Jesus as a prophet. And of course they believe that Muhammad is also a prophet of Allah. And so, although they don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God and triune and all that stuff, they still believe and have to respect Jesus as a true prophet sent to the people of his day to communicate the message of God. You'll notice there, by the way, I don't have a picture of Muhammad, and that's because, as you know, it's offensive to Muslims to show pictures of Muhammad. Not that we have actual photographs, but even a depiction. And since many Muslims attend my events, I just leave it out because it doesn't bother me to not show it, and there's no need to unnecessarily offend Muslims. So that's part of required belief systems in Islam, is to believe in God's prophets. Now, I just want to just clarify something about the nature of the Muslim version of Jesus. I've already kind of alluded to this, but they don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. They definitely reject that he's a part of the Trinity. They also don't believe that Jesus was crucified, because they don't think that a prophet of Allah would be deserving to die in a humiliating way as the way Christ died on the cross. And of course, if Jesus was not crucified, there's no way he could have been resurrected. And if he wasn't resurrected, he couldn't have atoned for sins. And that's why they believe that Jesus is merely a human being. He's a prophet, just like Moses or Muhammad. That's their view. Now, what's interesting, though, is that we think, wow, Muslims really downplay Jesus there a lot. And of course they do. They don't have an orthodox view of who Jesus is. But if you read the Quran, it's rather interesting to find out what the Quran just simply says about Jesus. And you'll find out that in the Quran, Jesus' birth is announced by angels. It says he was born of a Virgin Mary. It says that he performed miracles. The Quran talks about how Jesus was able to heal the sick and raise the dead. The Quran calls Jesus a sinless person. He lived a perfect life. The Quran even calls Jesus the Messiah. And according to the Quran, he never died. He was actually taken up to be in the presence of God. He's still alive today. And according to the Quran, he's appointed to return at the end of the age and usher in the end times. Well, that's pretty significant. That's a pretty high view of Christ. I mean, of course, it's not biblical, but nevertheless, these are all fairly significant. Now, what makes this even more interesting is when you compare what the Quran says with what the Quran says about Jesus to what it says about Muhammad, it's a rather stark contrast. You see, according to the Quran, there was no announcement about Muhammad's birth. He had just a normal birth. The Quran does not attribute any miracles to Muhammad. It doesn't say he was sinless. It doesn't call him the Messiah. And Muhammad actually just died, has been buried in Saudi Arabia for the last 1,400 years, and he's not coming back. And so that's why oftentimes if you want to talk to Muslims, talking about Jesus is a perfectly acceptable thing to do, because not only do they have to believe in him, but the Quran elevates him in a very significant way above that of Muhammad, as you can see from these ways. So just to keep that in mind. So, but again, bottom line is that belief in the prophets of God is a required belief. Okay. Now, continuing on with the 6 articles of faith, the 6 required beliefs, you also have belief in God's books. And according to Islam, there are 4 divine revelations of Allah. Okay? And these divine revelations have been given to prophets in order to be revealed to the people that those prophets speak to. So I'll give you a tip as to I'll tell you what the first one is. It's the Quran. Now, does anybody know what 1 or 2 or 3 of the other divine revelations are that are also on par with the Quran?
The Torah?
Yes, the Torah. So the Torah, they believe, is a true revelation given to the prophet Moses to the Jewish people. What else? 2 more.
Gospels?
Yes, the Gospels. That's right. And I'll just mention also the Psalms. So Muslims are required to believe that the Quran, the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel are true revelations of Allah on par with the Quran. Now, let me just stop screen sharing here for a second, but, whoops. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. If Muslims have to believe that the Torah and the Psalms and the Gospel are true revelations of Allah, and they have to believe in what the Gospels say, then why don't they believe what we believe about Jesus? Right? I mean, why don't they? Now, does anybody know why they don't?
I think they claim it's been corrupted. Right. Yeah.
Say it a little louder.
Been corrupted through
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes, they believe that although the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel and the Quran are true revelations of Allah, those last 3 have all been corrupted, and only the Quran has remained free from corruption. Now, this is very significant because this becomes the most common objection you will run across when you're talking to a Muslim. It is the #1 objection you'll hear, no matter whether they're a serious, a serious Orthodox Muslim or whether they're just a nominal kind of, cultural Muslim. Every one of these people, every one of these Muslims believes this: the Bible has been corrupted. The Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel have been corrupted, so they are not trustworthy. So it's the most common objection. But here's the problem: it also becomes the most serious objection because it undermines the precise source of authority that we want to use when we share the gospel of Jesus Christ and talk about who Jesus really is, right? Because the Gospels contain Christ's true identity as compared to what the Quran says, and the Gospels contain the message of salvation. And so that's why not only is it a common objection, it's a very serious objection, because once they dismissed all that, then of course we're left figuring out how we're supposed to respond and how we're supposed to make our case as ambassadors for Christ, trying to proclaim the message of reconciliation when that message and Christ's identity is found in the Gospels. And so I want to suggest to you a tactic that will help you overcome this challenge, because it really becomes the most serious challenge that we face. Let me just go back to my my slides here. And here's what is the way. Here's how I deal with it. Okay, remember I said that the Quran is the highest authority in Islam. Well, it turns out that the Quran teaches two important things about the Bible. The first is this: the Quran teaches that the words of God can't be changed or corrupted. Okay, and I've listed there 3 citations. I don't know if they're large enough for you to read or to jot down. Surah 6:34. Surah just means chapter. So chapter 6, verse 34. Chapter 6, verse 115, and chapter 10, verse 64. And in fact, probably 10 other passages in the Quran all teach unanimously that no one can change the words of Allah. Okay? They are unchangeable because, after all, they're divine revelation. But here's the other thing. The second thing that the Quran teaches is that the Bible, or specifically the Torah, Psalms, and Gospel, are an example of the Word of God. And you can find that in Surah 2:136, Surah 4:136, and Surah 29:46. And so, notice, if these two things are true, that the words of God can't be changed or corrupted, and the Bible is the Word of God, well then what logically follows? According to the Quran, the Bible could not have been changed or corrupted because it is also part of the words of God, and according to the Quran, you can't change the words of God. No mere mortal, no man, no person can change the words of God. And so the reason why this works is because it leverages the authority of the Quran, which is the highest authority in the mind of a Muslim, to your advantage. And it allows you to take their objection that the Bible is corrupted and dismiss it, move it out of the way, so that you can then continue on to explain the message of the gospel and the true identity of Christ. Okay? So again, I'm not trying to say, oh, Alan, well, why are you trying to prove the Bible is true and trustworthy by using the Quran? That seems ridiculous. No, I'm not doing that. I think the Bible is trustworthy and reliable and all that on its own for other reasons. But I'm saying that when you're speaking to a Muslim, you're going to be confronted with this objection that the Bible is corrupted all the time, no matter what you say. And unless you resolve this issue of authority, it'll be hard for you to get any further progress towards presenting the message of reconciliation to them. And so what this tactic does is simply it removes this objection off the table so they no longer keep asserting it to you. Because you can just remind them, hey, look, your own authority gives credibility to the source I'm talking about. So stop saying it's corrupted. Your Quran says it's not. Okay? And once they're in agreement with that, then you can move on and continue with what the Gospels say. So that's my suggestion to you as a tactic for how to resolve this massive problem. In fact, I remember one time I was speaking at I was at a maximum security state prison. So this is I live in San Diego, and near the border of Mexico and the United States is a maximum security state prison, and of course it contains very hardcore criminals. Most of these people have life terms. They're in there for murder, for rape, and other violent crimes. And it was the chaplain at that security prison who invited me to come and teach the Christian inmates that were in prison. And many of these inmates have Muslim cellmates. They literally live in a 2-person cell, and they're a Christian and their cellmate's probably a Muslim. So he asked me to come to the prison and teach these Christian prisoners how to witness to Muslims. So I said, sure. So I went to the prison, and you can just only imagine how much security there is to try to get just like some random person like me into a maximum security state prison to have direct access to all the prisoners inside in the prison yard. And so the security guards would walk me through various layers of security, you know, electric fences, you know, various large you know, towers that I had to walk past, all these different things. And finally, I got into the prison yard, and as the prison gates behind me closed, I noticed that the security guards were on the outside of the prison gates, and I was on the inside of the prison yard. And I said, what's the deal with that? And they said, oh, yeah, you're going to be here for the whole day, and we'll come and get you in the afternoon when you're done. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me? But it turned out to be okay, although at the time I was a little intimidated by that. But nevertheless, immediately, a young man comes up to me, and he was one of the prisoners. He said, hey, Brother Allen, my name is Brother Tom, and he said, you know, we're excited to have you. Do you have any notes that we can make photocopies of to give to the other prisoners when you're speaking on Islam? And I said, sure. So I handed him a piece of paper that had my notes, and he handed those notes to another inmate that was there next to us, who went off to make a photocopy. They make photocopies. Now, I didn't know they had photocopy machines in maximum security state prisons, but I guess they do. Go figure. But it turned out that that man who went to make photocopies was a Muslim. And so as he's walking off to make photocopies, he's looking at my notes and saying, hey, this Christian's going to be talking about Islam later this afternoon. And so in addition to making photocopies of my notes, guess what else he does? He tells all of the Muslim prisoners about this little event that we're having inside the prison. So that afternoon, I get up into this room that's probably maybe 2 or 3 times the size of the room that you guys are in, based on what I can see here. And probably, you know, 80 Christians rolled into that. You know, these are all prisoners. And in addition to those Christians, all these Muslims poured in as well. And I thought to myself, oh man, this is going to be interesting. But here's what happened. My intent was to train those Christians on how to reach out to Muslims. And so I basically went through a 1-hour version of that tactic that I just mentioned to you about showing the Quran and how it teaches that the Bible, that no one can change the words of God, and the Bible is an example of the Word of God, and so therefore the Bible is the uncorrupted Word of God. I went through that, and at the end I said, okay, are there any questions? Now, all the Christians were silent because they were curious, well, what are all their Muslim friends going to say? So finally a Muslim raises his hand, and he says to me, you know what, I haven't heard this before, but I agree with you. The Quran does not teach the Bible is corrupted. I said, okay, thank you very much. Another Muslim raises his hand. He says, yes, I too agree with you. And then a third Muslim raises his hand and says, yes, I agree with you as well. The Bible is not corrupted according to the Quran. Finally, a Muslim who was just irate gets up. He's so angry, and he starts to yell at his Muslim friends. He says, brothers, what are you saying? How could you agree with what this Christian is saying? How could you say that the Bible is not corrupted? And what he does is he cites a verse in the Quran which he believes says the Bible is corrupted. But guess who came to my defense? The Muslims. Those Muslims stood up and said, no, sit down. What you're saying is not correct. We've looked at that verse, and we know that that verse does not say that the Bible is corrupted, but rather that the Christians misinterpret what the Bible says. Now again, I'm not saying this because, oh wow, how special Alan is. You know, I didn't make up this tactic. It's just a tactic I used. The point I'm trying to make is the reason why the tactic worked is because they think the Quran is the highest authority in all of the world. And so if you can show them something is taught from the Quran, then they have to accept it. Otherwise, they're not only rejecting the highest authority, they're rejecting the commands of Allah. And so that's why it worked. So, if you want, by the way, I don't know if Scott and Aubrey made this aware, but I've written a short booklet. It's only like 60 pages or something, very short, which highlights or basically describes this tactic, and then also gives you a little overview about Islam if you ever are interested in learning more about this tactic. You can get it from our website, and I'm sure Scott and Aubrey can point you to that. But to continue on with this notion of the articles of faith, the 6 required beliefs, the 5th one is the belief in the final judgment, and this is simply the idea that at the end of time, everyone will be resurrected, and they will be judged, and Allah will judge all people according to their deeds. In other words, Islam has a meritorious-based system of salvation. And you remember those 2 angels I talked to you about that follow you on your left and right shoulders? Well, all the good deeds and bad deeds that they've collected, they're going to put them on this scale. And if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, well, then you go to heaven. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, then you go to hell. And so there really is no way to be certain of your salvation, because you can't possibly know what good deeds and bad deeds you've done, because you're not keeping score, you're not keeping track, the angels are. And so there is no assurance of salvation for Muslims. In fact, every Muslim I've talked to, whenever I've asked them this question, they never tell me they're certain they're going to heaven. And of course, that's something that we as believers can do, and that is assure them that, yes, with Christ you can have that assurance. So that's by the way, another entry point I make when I'm talking to Muslims, is the whole notion of assurance of salvation. And then the 6th required belief in Islam is the belief in divine destiny. And this is basically the doctrine that everything that happens in the world occurs by the divine decree of Allah. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, how does that fit with, free will? What do they think about that? All I'm here to tell you is, I don't know. I've studied this a lot, and I still don't know how to reconcile it. It's almost like kind of the paradox that we think about with God's sovereignty and man's free will. I'm not saying it's parallel, but I'm just saying it's, sometimes these concepts are hard to grasp, and I'm just telling you this is their 6th required belief. I'm not telling you I necessarily understand it. So, but that is the 6th required belief. So notice what we've tried to do is I've tried to give you a little bit of some information as to what, as an ambassador for Jesus Christ, we need to do, and that is to learn about Islam and learn about Muslims. Okay, and so I've talked to you about the pillars, the articles of faith. These are required beliefs and behaviors, and then a tactic for how to figure out what is truly Islamic or not. And of course, that's by looking at those 3 sources, and then also a tactic to deal with the most common objection, okay, which is that the Bible is corrupted. And so just the second part, which is a lot shorter than the first, so don't fret, is that as an ambassador, not only do we need to learn about Islam, but we also need to learn how to engage Muslims, because that's what an ambassador does. They don't just learn about something, but once they learn about the people, their beliefs, their culture, all that stuff, then we need to learn how to engage. And I remember when I first started witnessing to Muslims, it was probably, now maybe about 8 years ago. I went to a area in Southern California that has a huge population of Muslims, and as I was driving around their neighborhood, I could tell I was in the right place because all of the stores had Arabic script for their names. And so I parked into a strip mall and the parking lot, and I saw 2 men who were pretty young, and they looked like me, and so I thought, okay, these guys have to be Muslims. And I ran up to them just before they were about to enter into the restaurant, and I stopped them, and I said, excuse me, I said, are you guys Muslims? And they kind of looked at each other a little, hesitantly, because they're wondering, who's this stranger? And they said, yeah, we're Muslims. And I said, oh, great. I said, hey, I'm a Christian. I said, would you like to talk about God and Jesus in the Bible? Now, what do you think they said? Well, actually, they said, yes, we'd love to. Come on in, sit down. And so I went in with them into the restaurant. We sat down, and for about 2 hours, we talked about God and Jesus and the Bible. And, of course, we didn't agree on everything, but we had a very vigorous discussion. And finally, it was so late, I thought to myself, man, my wife's going to worry, where I am. I told them I had to leave. And as I was leaving, they insisted on paying for my entire meal. Now, contrast that experience with what would have happened if I had walked up to 2 just average Americans, not religious Americans, just average Americans, and said to them, excuse me, I'm a Christian. Would you like to talk about God and Jesus in the Bible? What do you think they'd say? Get lost, right? Creep, freaky person, what's wrong with you? Of course not, And so this goes to show how much Muslims love to talk about God and Jesus in the Bible. They love to talk about religion. And in fact, starting a conversation about religion with a Muslim, it's like starting a conversation with an American about sports. It's virtually effortless. You just start it, and it goes. And so this should make us very encouraged and motivated to want to talk to Muslims, because they are so eager to want to talk about that. Now, of course, it's not all of them, but I'd say the vast majority of instances where I've walked up to complete strangers, Muslims, and tried to start a conversation about religion, it has worked out just fine. So this gives us a great opportunity to do that. Now, the good news is that there are a lot of Muslims to talk to. In fact, there are, this slide here just shows, again, another picture of Mecca. And you can see that mosque, and all those little dots are people, literally millions of people. Estimates put the number of Muslims worldwide at about 1.5 billion. 1.5 billion Muslims. That means 1 in 5 people on the planet is a Muslim. Now, that's a lot of Muslims. And if you think of it from a missions perspective, Muslims represent the largest unreached people group on the planet. In fact, every day, 38,000 Muslims die and enter eternity without Jesus Christ. That's startling. 38,000. And so this really should try to encourage us to want to care about reaching Muslims. Now, just to give you a quick breakdown on those 1.5 billion Muslims, we think that our best estimates put the number of Muslims that are nominal, meaning in name only. These are Muslims that are born in a Muslim family, born in a Muslim country. They don't really read the Quran. They don't go to mosque. They don't know much about their faith. Probably 70% of all Muslims worldwide are this category of nominal. Now, another 15% of Muslims we would call reformed. And these are Muslims who are very serious about their faith. They read the Quran. They study the Hadith. They know about the Sunnah. They attend mosque regularly. But when it comes to some of the more violent passages in the Quran, when it comes to violent jihad or treating women that way that we often see women treated in Saudi Arabia, fully veiled, not allowed to get a driver's license and all that, these guys would say, no, we don't really follow that. That was for another time. But then there's another 15% of Muslims that the media likes to call radical. These Muslims are like their reformed brethren in that they do read the Quran, they do attend mosque, they do study the Hadith, but they take the Quran and Hadith very seriously. And when it comes to those violent passages, they say, no, absolutely, it's still part of what it means to be a Muslim today, is to follow that stuff. Now, 15% of Muslims worldwide might not seem like a lot, but when you think about how many Muslims there are, that's like, I don't know, 225 million Muslims. Okay, that's like 2/3 the population of the United States that believes in this radical view of Islam. These are Muslims who would either attitudinally support violent jihad or financially back it or participated in it themselves. So that's kind of a sobering statistic there. Now the question then becomes, well, how should we engage these Muslims? And I believe it's the way any ambassador would try to engage people who don't agree with them, and that is to do it with knowledge, wisdom, and character. And Paul gives us some clues about what it means to have good character. In 2 Timothy 2, where Paul is writing his protege, this is his last epistle before he dies, he says this: the Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged, with gentleness correcting those who are in opposition, if perhaps God may grant them repentance, leading to the knowledge of the truth. So I don't know about you, but that's not easy for me, to be patient when I'm wronged, and to be gentle, and to correct those who are in opposition, like Muslims, in a gentle and kind way. Because oftentimes they can be very aggressive. Not all the time, but many times they can be. Or Colossians 4:5 says, look, we need to let our conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so so that we might know how to respond and answer each person. And, you know, I think some practical ways that this looks in everyday kind of conversations with Muslims is that I believe that we should focus our message when we talk to Muslims on one thing, and that's the gospel of Jesus Christ. When I talk to Muslims, I don't have any kind of clever tract or a clever approach I take. I just simply try to present the gospel of Jesus Christ straight up. And when they don't like to hear that because they think, well, you know, we don't believe about Jesus, or we don't believe in the Gospels, then I, of course, invoke my tactic that helps to eliminate that objection. But at the end of the day, I'm simply focusing on the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what I present to anybody who doesn't know, who isn't a Christian. Now, that's what we should focus on, and a couple of things that we should try to avoid are, one, and this is something that I see a lot of Christians do, is they focus on the topic of jihad. Now, I have a whole talk on violent jihad, so I'm not saying I don't think it's a valuable question to ask or it's not an interesting question to discuss. What I'm saying is when you're trying to present to Muslims, oftentimes Christians will make that the main issue of discussion, and oftentimes all that does is create barriers to the gospel. It doesn't oftentimes lead Muslims to want to consider the gospel any more than had they not heard that. So my suggestion to you is to avoid conversations that detract from the main message that we should be focusing on, and that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. The other thing that I see a lot of Christians want to bring up is the fact that Muhammad, when he was in his 50s, well, he married about 11 women that we know of, but one of his women that he married, which was the youngest of them, was named Aisha. He married her when he was in his 50s, when she was at the age of 6. And he consummated that marriage when she was only 9. Now, obviously that's disturbing, but what happens is a lot of Christians will see this as ammo because they'll think, well, how could any Muslim be affirming of that? How could they defend Muhammad in that instance? And while I agree with them that this is a horrible thing, all I found is that when people bring this up, it just alienates Muslims from the person they're talking to, and of course alienates them from the gospel of Jesus Christ, of which they are an ambassador of. And that's why I say, look, I understand these are important issues, but sometimes we have to think more strategically and be savvy ambassadors to think, man, what is the most beneficial thing I could say to try to reach this Muslim? Because look, if they accept the gospel of Jesus Christ, they will also reject those beliefs about jihad and those beliefs about Muhammad as well. So that's why I say, when it comes to figuring out how should we respond, and those two passages on 2 Timothy and Colossians, those are ways which I think are practical applications of those passages with respects to speaking to Muslims. Actually, there's something that we often say at Stand to Reason. We say, look, the gospel's offensive enough. Don't add any more offense to it. It's already plenty hard to accept the gospel. You know, it's like we don't have to make it harder by bringing in things that are going to raise barriers to that gospel. So let me just close with this thought, and I'll take some questions. But you know, after September 11th, many people said we became engaged in a war against terror and against, you know, Muslim extremists. And they're right about one thing: we are engaged in a war, but they are wrong about two things, and that is when the war began and who we are at war with. You see, the war did not begin when the first plane hit the World Trade Center. The war began when Eve took her first bite. And it's not a war against Muslims, and even Muslim extremists. Muslims are not the enemy. Muslims are hostages of the enemy. They are, you know, prisoners of war, if you will. They have fallen prey to this belief system known as Islam, of which I believe Satan himself has erected. You know, so the true war is against Satan, his lies, his army. He is actually the true terrorist. And in fact, 5 chapters after Paul tells us that we are an ambassador for Christ, Paul tells us the nature of the war that we are in. In fact, I'm just going to look it up here real quick. 2 Corinthians, here it is. 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5, Paul says this. He says, For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not of the world. In other words, they're not guns, they're not tanks, they're not airplanes. Those are the weapons that the world fights with. And Paul goes on. He says, on the contrary, the weapons we fight with have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. You see, it is the enemy Satan who has erected the stronghold of Islam and who has taken prisoner and captive 20% of the world's population. And so between now and tomorrow, another 38,000 Muslims will be claimed by Satan and will enter eternity without Christ. So yes, we are at a war. The enemy is real, but Muslims are not the enemy. They're hostages of the enemy, and God has made us ambassadors for His Son Jesus Christ to proclaim that message of reconciliation. That's our identity, that's our mission, and I think that's how we should try to reach Muslims. So, having said that, are there questions or comments or concerns? Maybe something you didn't agree with, which is totally fine. It wouldn't be the first time that you have that I can answer.
If anyone has any questions, it can speak up pretty loud so we can hear you. And then Jim has a question.
Alan, you were saying, that to study the Quran or to know the Quran. I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard that they wouldn't accept, or Muslims won't accept an English version of the Quran because it's not the original language, I guess.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Now, not all Muslims will make a point about this, but it's true that Muslims believe that the only true Quran is one that is in Arabic. Once you translate it into another language, it is no longer a Quran. It is not even a translation of the Quran. They would say it's only a commentary. So it's true that that's sort of the most common, well, not the most common, it's a very common belief, and it's believed by a lot of Orthodox Muslims. But here's the interesting thing. The vast majority of the world's Muslim population doesn't even know Arabic. And so most Muslims on the planet, literally most, never read the Quran in Arabic. They always read a Quran that's in their language. Now, I'm sympathetic to what they're saying because I speak the language of Assyrian. I'm Assyrian. I speak Assyrian, not as in Syria Assyrian, but Assyrian, which is an old language that, for the most part, is dying out. And many times my wife, who's German, who does not know Assyrian, she'll ask me, Alan, what did your dad just say to you? And I'll try to translate it, but you know how if you know another language, sometimes some expressions just are not translatable. But I can still communicate the basic gist of what's being taught. And I think that's the case with the Quran as well. Yes, maybe you can't communicate every Arabic idea across into English, but there are a lot of Islamic scholars that have done fine work in translating the Quran into ways in which people who speak English can understand. And so I sometimes will just say, look, most Muslims in the world don't even know Arabic, so why are you making a big fuss about this? But second of all, I say, look, when I cite passages of the Quran, they are based on interpretations and understandings of Islamic scholars who do know Arabic. So I'm never saying anything that already Islamic scholars don't already believe. For example, when I cited those surahs, when I was talking about the tactic I used to respond to that objection, in my larger teaching on this, I actually cite the Quranic verses, the English, and I point out to Muslims, look, the greatest Islamic scholars in history all affirm that what I'm communicating here is accurate. I'm not inventing something just because I don't know Arabic. So I try to make that point when talking about that. Having said that, if you want an English translation, the best English translation, or the one that most Muslims might be okay with, is the one that's translated by a guy named Yusuf Ali. It's spelled Y-U-S-U-F space A-L-I. Yusuf Ali. Y-U-S-U-F space A-L-I. His name is Abdullah Yusuf Ali, and if you get his English translation, it's one that sounds the most like a kind of a King James translation, a lot of these and thous and stuff. And it's the one that many Muslims will say, yeah, well, that's probably a decent English one. And you can get it at any bookstore for the most part. Also, you can get the entire Quran in multiple translations at this website. There's a university in Southern California called the University of Southern California, USC, very famous university. And on their website, they have a Jewish-Muslim dialogue, and they have 3 translations, all available for free online. And it's searchable, it's indexed, it's very easy, and you can kind of see all translations put together all at once. It's kind of nice. And if you just go to USC's website or just Google USC, online Quran, you'll find it right away. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Okay, good. Yes.
I had a question. You said Muslims believe Christ is coming back again. What do they believe that will look like when Christ comes back?
Yeah, good question. So there are varying sects in Islam, various factions, okay? And you've probably heard of the 2 main ones, Sunni and Shia Muslims, or Shiite. And Iran is composed mostly of Shiite Muslims. They're the minority, maybe about 10% or so, or 15% of Muslims worldwide. Sunni Muslims are the most dominant. They're probably about 85% worldwide. And in particular, Shiite Muslims have developed a very detailed view of end times and Jesus. But they believe that Jesus will return with another famous Islamic figure known as the Mahdi. And along with Jesus, they will kill the Antichrist when they return on earth. They will break all the crosses. They will kill all the pigs. And they will basically end the time in which we are allowed to participate in life, and we'll be judged. So no more pulled pork sandwiches, obviously, because they'll be killing all the pigs. But they believe, of course, the cross is a invention of Christianity, and so that's why they're going to be breaking all the crosses, and killing the Antichrist. So Jesus will partake in that process, according to Shiite Islam. It's rather interesting. I mean, Muhammad again is not the one who's coming. It's Jesus. He's the one, because he's alive. Muhammad's dead right now. So yeah, it's really interesting. But there's all sorts of variations on that eschatology from different Muslim factions. So it's hard to kind of keep track of all of it. But that's a very prominent one that I just described.
Alan, if you were speaking to a Muslim and role playing right now, would you say the gospel of the Lord Jesus to us?
I'm sorry, you're kind of breaking in and out on that one. Could you ask it again, please?
If you were speaking to a Muslim in dialogue,
yes,
would you right now speak the gospel of the Lord Jesus as you understand it? What would you say to him?
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So I think I understood what you're saying. Are you asking me, if I was speaking to a Muslim now, what would I say is the gospel?
Yes, how would you say that? This is the gospel of the Lord Jesus. What would you say?
Oh.
How would that look?
Well, okay, obviously it depends on the context of where the conversation was at the time. But as I mentioned, one thing I like to ask Muslims, I say this. I say, let's say his name is Saeed. I say, Saeed, listen, let me ask you, are you sure you're going to heaven? And if so, how do you know? And like I said, most of them will say, no, I don't know. And I'll say, why don't you know? And he's like, well, because I don't know if my good deeds and bad deeds. And so he'll kind of give me the thing about that. And I'll say, well, that's why, I'll tell him, I said, look, that's why you need to listen to what Jesus says. In the Gospels, Jesus says that he can give you assurance of salvation because all those bad deeds you've committed can be pardoned. God's offering you a pardon for all those bad deeds, so you don't have to worry about putting them on a scale. That's what the Gospels teach. Now, of course, he'll so I'm just going based on a hypothetical context, but I'm just trying to give him an opportunity to consider the gospel. And and I'm going to then offer for him to read. And so I'll offer him an opportunity to read what the Gospels say specifically about that. And if he gives me concern or hesitation about that, I'll remind him that that the Quran, his highest authority, doesn't have any problem with the Bible, with the Gospel. By the way, whenever I say Bible, what I mean by that is Torah, Psalms, Gospel. But because it takes so long, I'm just saying Bible as a stand-in for Torah, Psalms, Gospel. But just to be clear, the Quran only refers to the Torah, Psalms, and Gospels as being divine revelations, not the whole Bible. I do believe there is an argument to be made that the whole Bible is part of the Word of God according to the Quran, but I haven't made that argument right here. I'm just saying that's what I believe. So, anyways, so often the topic of salvation is the way that I come about it, and by asking them what they think about their own salvation. And then sometimes another way I'll do it is I'll just simply spell out the gospel in a non-religious way. So I'll say to him, look, don't you believe people who commit moral crimes ought to be punished? And they're like, yeah, of course I believe people who commit crimes ought to be punished. I'll say, so do I. Then I'll ask them, say, well, have you ever committed a moral crime? And they'll say, yeah, of course. Because they're Muslims, they often will agree that they've committed things that are wrong. And I'll say, so have I. I've committed moral crimes as well. I'll say, do you know what that means? If we both believe people who commit moral crimes ought to be punished, and we both believe that we've committed moral crimes, then that means we both believe that we ought to be punished. And that's bad news, So that's when it makes sense then to introduce the gospel, because I've now just put myself and him or her in the same situation. We're both in a bad situation. And then I'll remind him, or not remind him, but I'll tell him, look, God is willing to offer us a pardon, right? And of course, here's how the pardon works. He says, look, you are guilty, you deserve to be punished, but I'm willing to make a deal with you. I'm willing to punish my son, Jesus, instead of punishing you. But in return, I need a lifetime of commitment, a commitment for you to commit your life to me for your lifetime. So you can accept that deal and get a pardon and not be punished, or you can pay for the crime yourself. Okay? That, in essence, is what the gospel says. So I'm going to explain it to him and give him an opportunity to respond to it. And then, of course, it depends on what he says will affect how I respond. If he rejects, that description of what the pardon that God offers, then I'm going to point him to the Gospels. So again, it all varies, but I'm just speaking in the hypothetical. I don't know if that helps, or if does that answer your question, or.
Yeah.
Good. Yes.
Go ahead.
I was wondering, you said looks like an example about Muslims. I was wondering how with things of Muhammad like that, not necessarily good examples, but you're heading up a lot of Jews in Medina, or his child bride, or his putting to death of poets who mocked him, and those kind of things. Now, does it avoid it altogether, or how does it handle those situations?
I think you muted him. It's not muted him for some reason. Let's see.
Alan?
You muted Alan, and he's trying to talk.
I know. Can you hear me, Alan?
Yeah.
Click the unmute button at the top. I'm trying to unmute it.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Did you hear what I just said, or no?
No.
Okay. So I was saying that I couldn't hear what he was saying because some of the times when he was speaking quietly, it dropped out. Could you repeat it?
Can I jump in real quick, Bob?
Yeah.
Aubrey, if you can mute Alan if someone's asking a question, because you're getting echo.
Okay.
Or actually, Alan, if you can, when someone's asking a question, mute on your end.
Okay. I'll mute my end.
And see if that fixes.
Okay. Go ahead and ask the question again.
Don't mute, Aubrey. Don't mute there. You need to unmute. You need to unmute Aubrey at that on your end.
I was trying to mute you.
There you go. There you go. Now don't touch it. Leave it. And Alan can mute himself. So go ahead, Gary.
Don't mute it.
No, he's not. It'll be red. I know that's really confusing.
Okay.
Go ahead, Gary.
You said earlier that the Sunnah looks at Muhammad's life as an example that all good Muslims should follow. And I wondered how it deals with, for example, Aisha, or the fact that Muhammad had about 800 Jews beheaded in Medina, or that he married his daughter-in-law, or that he had poets put to death and things like that. Does it deal with those, or does it avoid them?
No, the Sunnah incorporates those elements that you just listed, which are part of his biography. And, you know, by the way, you can get his biography. The most early extant biography we have is by Ibn Ishaq, called The Life of Muhammad. And yes, it documents exactly what you just said, that he beheaded 800 Jews in one night. That was the last Jewish tribe in Medina. You're right, he had poets who were assassinated. Many non-combatants were assassinated, and he married all of these people. He had child brides. He condoned sex, slavery, all these things. So you're asking me, does the Sunnah incorporate that? Well, that is his Sunnah.
How
And
that is an example that we should follow.
How is it an example for them to follow?
How does it deal with that as an example?
Well, it is an example. That is the example, and that's why you have many times child brides in the Middle East. That's why you have violent jihad occurring today. That's why beheadings occur by organizations like ISIS and others. These are not non-Islamic associations. They are Islamic, and they specifically cite the Sunnah and the Quran and the Hadith in their justification for doing those exact things. So this is why that's a problem. This is why the Sunnah is a problem. It incorporates those things as part of the life Muhammad lived. In fact, if you ever saw video footage of Osama bin Laden, sometimes they will release it on CNN or Fox News as part of it. But what people don't notice is the very things that he was doing when he was sitting in a cave, you know, in a circle with all of his cabinet or whatever you want to call it. He would sometimes reach over, if one of his people didn't finish their food, he'd reach over and grab their food and eat from their own plate to finish the food. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but that's exactly what Muhammad did. And Osama bin Laden is intentionally modeling himself after the Sunnah of Muhammad because he's portraying himself as a person who is following Islam in the true sense of the word. That's not politically correct to say, but unfortunately that's following the Sunnah of Muhammad in the exact way. So if I understand your question, and correct me if I'm wrong in just a second here, but those actions of Muhammad that are recorded in his biography make up part of his Sunnah and are authoritative for Muslims today. And unfortunately, those Muslims that practice it are consistent with that, and those that don't practice it or say it's for that time are living inconsistently with Islam. ISIS, for example, the Islamic State that you've probably heard about in the news, they not only claim to be, the founder, al-Baghdadi, the guy who's the head of the Islamic State, has a PhD in Islamic studies. These are not savages who are running around in tents. These people know exactly what they're doing, and they bathe everything that they do in Islamic doctrine and Hadith and Sunnah and Quran. So, anyway, sorry. But did I answer your question about the incorporation of those actions as a part of the Sunnah?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions, and then we'll let you go, Alan. Jim had another question, and Tony did too. Go ahead, Jim.
Alan, have you ever run into the situation where those that you were talking to question the different sects of Christianity? Catholicism, Baptist, and that kind of thing. I mean, do they use that as an argument? Anyways, that's my question.
Yes, okay. I would say, on average, no. That's not a very common argument I've heard. I have heard it been made, although not just from Muslims, but from. Oh, hold on a second here. My battery's running low on my computer. Hold on, let me just make sure it's plugged in. Kyle, can you come over here a second? I thought this was plugged in, but it's not. Is there a plug I can? That's fine. Plug it in there. Sorry, buddy. Sorry about that. I was plugged in to an outlet, but it was unplugged. I didn't know that, so my computer battery was slowly dying. Okay, but now we're okay. Okay, so getting back to your question. I've heard that challenge raised not just by Muslims but by other non-Muslims as well. The way that the Muslim, and it was a while ago, so I could be a little foggy about my recollection of the way the Muslim captured this argument, but he basically said that because of all the divisions and factions and splits in Christianity, this is a testament to the fact that it's not an authentic religion, whereas in Islam, you had the Quran, and all Muslims are brothers of one sort of brotherhood, if you will. But you can obviously see the error in this argument, probably, and that is that Islam itself is divided into at least 3 large sects: Sunni, Shia, and Sufis. And then within those sects, you have all sorts of different additional smaller sects as well. So, but again, I have to tell you that, for the most part, I rarely have heard that as an argument from a Muslim.
Thank you.
Tony?
Yes, you said earlier that Muslims believe that the Quran is the uncorrupted Word of God. So, in that line, have they done textual criticism of the Quran in a similar way that people have criticized or done the criticism on the Bible, like the Bart Ehrman style of what is this really?
Yeah, good question. And it's funny. Bart Ehrman is one of their biggest heroes, because Bart Ehrman, as you know, loves to criticize the Bible, and so they often will quote him. But to answer your question, there has not been the same level of textual criticism applied to Quranic studies as there has been with the Bible. In fact, it has been quite the opposite, that anybody who sought to try to do investigative textual criticism on the Quran has gotten in trouble. Now, this has the basic answer to your question is no. There has not been even remotely close to the same kind of textual criticism that's been done with the Quran as the Bible. The Bible has been evaluated on that level and in that way for a long time, and all the manuscripts of the Bible are, for the most part, available to anybody to do this kind of investigative work, whereas the manuscripts of the Quran have been guarded heavily and are never allowed to be criticized in the same way. Having said that, in the 1970s, there was a mosque in Yemen that was having reconstruction work done on it, and as the workers were breaking down some walls, they found some scrolls, and it turned out that these scrolls were ancient Quranic manuscripts from the 7th century, which turned out to be the earliest manuscripts that we have of the Quran. Now, there are very few people in the world that are qualified to evaluate and assess what those scripts are and how to read them. And so the country of Yemen, the government of Yemen, asked a German man, an Orientalist named Gerhard Puin, to come to Sana'a, Yemen, and to investigate over a period of, I think, a couple of years, these manuscripts. Now, part of the deal was that this German man was not allowed to then released the studies and conclusions and results of his work to the public. However, he has given some hints as to what will be discovered in those manuscripts should they ever be released. And that is that there has been a history of revision and changes that have been made to the textual source material of the Quran that would probably bring frustration and embarrassment to Muslims who claim that the Quran has been uncorrupted since the time it was in the presence of Allah, to the time it was dictated by the angel Gabriel to Muhammad, and to the time it was memorized and then eventually laid down in print, and then until eventually it was copied till today. They believe that that whole circle has been free from absolutely any corruption. And what we're hearing is that this man Gerhard Puin is giving us indication that that's not the case. Indeed, there have been now more and more people who have begun studying the Quran in a way in which they're investigating textual criticism of the Quran and finding out that this is not the case. But this kind of study is still in its infancy for the Quran. But my suspicion is that after this man, this German man, Gerhard Puin, is dead, and his wife is dead, that there will be something that will come out that will reveal more information about that. Because we have, I have friends who are friends with him, and so I think that there's going to be more interesting information about specifically those details that will come out after his death.
All right.
Do you have time for one more?
Do you have time for one more question?
Yes.
Okay.
I wanted to know, is it only the extremists that believe the annihilation of Israel? Do the reforms Muslims believe that too, or exactly? Can you answer that?
Yeah, that's a good question. You can't really. How do I say this? The answer is no. It's basically all sorts of Muslims, whether nominal, reformed, or radical, as they would call them. You could find Muslims in all three of those groups believing that. So it's not limited to any particular demographic, if you will.
Okay. Well, I've also heard that
Yeah,
there's
go ahead.
no such thing as a moderate is a Muslim. Is that true too? That if you really are a Muslim, if you are told by your mosque authority that you must follow some of these harsh things from the
Yes, I understand.
that truly all believing Muslims are not Muslims. They are more extremist. Is that true then?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, okay, so yeah, from my perspective, moderate Muslims are not living consistently with the way Islam is supposed to be. Now, that doesn't mean that I believe that all radical Muslims are living consistently. But the Muslims like Queen Rania, for example, who considers herself to be a devout Muslim, who says that no, you can't treat women this way. You know, wearing a hijab is optional. Violence is never, condoned. The kind of Muslim that says this, she might be sincere in her faith, but this is not what Muhammad taught. It's not what the Quran teaches, and it's not what is in the Hadith. So I would say that she is not living consistently with Islam. And those moderate Muslims who say, well, I believe in this part of Islam, but I think it's been changed or whatever, I would say that they're not living consistently with Islam either. The only way to really measure this question is to ask or to find out from the Muslim, how well do you follow the three sources of authority, the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sunnah? And unfortunately, many of the Muslims that do that today are the ones that we hear about in the news that are practicing violence. Now, I do not mean to suggest then that all Muslims practice violence, obviously, because most Muslims don't. But the idea that Islam, here's the way I hear it put, Islam's a religion of peace. It's just been hijacked by violent terrorists. Okay? I think the opposite's true. Islam's a violent religion that's been hijacked by largely peaceful Muslims. because at its core, Islam teaches violence or condones it, not in any case, not in any circumstance. I'm not saying any Muslim can go kill any non-Muslim at any time for any reason, but definitely violent jihad is a valid Islamic doctrine that's permissible in Islam, and that's part of the core of Islam. In fact, they would actually say that if you shirk your responsibility from violent jihad, you are abandoning a pillar of Islam. So I would say at its core, Islam teaches violence, but thankfully there's a lot of Muslims who are trying to reform it. But once they reform it, it won't be the true Islam anymore. It'll be some other version. So I don't know if that answers what you're asking me, but tell me if it is, or if I'm helping at all or not.
Well, I think that you help clarify that, because in other words, that those who are reforming it really aren't the Muslims.
Well, they would claim. I wouldn't say to their face, "Well, you're not a Muslim." I would just say, "Yeah, that's fine. I'm glad for you, Mr. Moderate Muslim. I'm really glad for you, and I hope you win in the sense of reforming your religion, because the ones that are on the radical side, which I believe are genuine, are causing havoc in our world." So I would applaud the moderate Muslim who wants to reform it. I would encourage him, and I hope he wins. I don't think it's going to happen, but I'm his cheerleader, if you will.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Alan, for taking the time to talk to us and stuff and teach. Is there any plug that you want to say for your book? I know it's on STR's website, and I'll pull that up in a second when we get off the air. But is there anything else you want to say about your book?
No, it's just the meat of the book is basically that tactic I mentioned in an expanded form. But then I also have some short sections on just the basics of Islam, the reasoning behind, violent jihad, the reasoning behind how Islam treats women. So there's some more details on that stuff.
Okay.
But other than that, no, it's a short book intended to be, you can read it in an hour or two. So that's the goal, to make it accessible.
I myself have personally read it, and I really enjoyed it, so thank you.
Oh, good, thank you.
You have one other book, too, The Ambassador's Guide, don't you?
Yeah, I have an Ambassador's Guide to Understanding Homosexuality.
Okay.
And so I do a lot of work on that subject and a lot of speaking on the subject. And so it's basically a book that covers, the main meat of it is the whole question about, are you born gay? Is it genetic? And then I talk specifically about the details of same-sex attraction and what causes same-sex attraction. And then I talk about some practical principles that we can apply in our relationships with people who identify as gay or lesbian that we might have in our family. I particularly have several people in my family that identify as gay or lesbian. And so for many years now, including this past Christmas and Thanksgiving, we have these people at our home. And so we're constantly asking the question, how do we as Christians who want to maintain our Christian convictions, not compromise biblically, maintain our relationships with these individual people who are oftentimes perceive us as hating them, So it talks. That's what the book's about. And again, it's like the Islam book. It's about 70 or so pages, intended to be short and easy to read and accessible.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you.
And then I think Scott's gonna come on. You can go ahead. You can go ahead and disconnect if you want.
Okay. I'll hang up.
Thank
Hey,
you.
I hope to come to Michigan soon. I was in where was I? Petoskey?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been to Petoskey a few times to speak, so hopefully, I'll bug. Well, you guys know him, Pastor Bridge. I'll try to get him to come out there, and maybe I could come out to your neck of the woods as well when that all comes down.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'd wait for summer. Not soon.
What was that?
I'd wait for summer.
Oh yeah, yeah. They actually usually do, just for my benefit. So.
All right.
All right. Okay. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
No, Scott had something. Okay. I don't know if he must not be, I can't even really see that.
What church is it that he, really noisy?
Where do you see that?
Oh. Thanks so much, Alan. And off screen, but I have volume bumped up.
Okay.
It has
Assignment by Ellen's book.
yes.
All right.
Are all the present? No, not